Hello, my name is BrianTheBrain. And why am I a brain with hair, you ask? Well, why are you a head with hair? Assume you still have it, of course, and if not, then that's a weird question for you to ask. Let me ask you all this. What is the first thing you think of when you hear the words video games? Some of you may think of the games themselves, some of you may think of the consoles or computer you play them on. But for me, and I assume many others, one of the first things I think of when I hear those words are the controllers we used to play those games. After all, how would you be able to make Luigi do the funny taunt in Smash Bros without them? Video game controllers are a staple in gaming, a staple that goes as far back as the games themselves, all the way from Tennis for 2, which used a knob and a button, to the DualSense and the Xbox Series X controllers of today. Video game controllers have seen quite the evolution. Now of course, there have been quite a few terrible game controllers in history. Atari Jaguar controller, anyone? There also have been a lot of great game controllers, the ones that just melt into your hands and you let the good old muscle memory do the work, and also have superb ergonomic design. Where would we be without the analog stick? Well, probably in a ditch, but it's good that we don't have to ask that question. However, we of course know where we were without it in the days of old, where bleeps and bloops were all the rage and we didn't think we can get any better than that. Controllers around that time were very simple. Most of the time you would only have either a knob and a button, and a joystick with a button, like with the famous Atari 2600 controller. This was certainly the peak of controllers during that time. But when your competition is the Intellivision and Colecovision controllers, it isn't exactly hard to beat that. Seriously, who the hell thought it was a good idea to make these game controllers look like alien cell phones? Not to knock the Atari 2600 controller and its importance in gaming of course, but cracks do show when you try to use it today. It's aged rather poorly, to say the least. The joystick itself is stiff and awkward to use, and the button is in a not so preferable place, which can make it a bit tedious to jump or do whatever the game used the button for. This controller has definitely seen better days, but it's integral to where we later improve on what a game controller could and should be. After the video game crash in 1983, video gaming would see a massive halt in progress for pretty much everything in the industry, specifically in the US. People lost the motivation and reason to keep supporting the industry after all of the awful quality control abundance of choice. And you think that last one would be a good thing in a competitive market, but it made the consumer confused on what they should get. And they would usually just say, yeah, screw this, and then watch to touch video games with a 10-foot pole. Now, over in Japan, it was vastly different. The industry there was more popular than ever, especially after the recent release of the Famicom by everyone's favorite company to hate on nowadays, Nintendo. At first, Nintendo was hesitant to release the Famicom in the States because of, you know, the rapture, so they waited 2 years before they decided that it was a good time to give the Famicom to them. But not before redesigning it to appeal to that Western audience, where it would go by the Nintendo Entertainment System. The console was a smash hit, and the pack-in title Super Mario Bros. Is definitely to thank for that. But honestly, it's hard to imagine the NES being much of a success without its brilliant controller. Goodbye joystick and hello... a cross? Heh, nah. This is of course the D-pad, first seen in certain Game & Watch systems, and it would go on to be essential in any game controller ever since. It has just the right size, it feels great, and can potentially be used to teach a kid about addition. What's not to love? Going from the Atari 2600's one button, we have 3 buttons in the form of B, Start, and Select. The placement of the faceplate is something to squeak at. It makes running and jumping in a game like Super Mario Bros. Sound much better, and the Start and Select buttons are great when you want to take a break from the game and contemplate what else to do with your life. This controller is still great to this day, and in my opinion, was integral to the success of the NES. There's one personal problem I have with it though. Corners? Sharp corners? Yeah, the controller becomes a bit uncomfortable to use after long play sessions. Those corners really like to dig into your hands, and it's quite annoying. Looking past that, however, this is still a great controller. So I guess that's why other companies try to rip it off, like with the Sega Master System controller and the TurboGrafx 16 controller. Now, moving forward in time again, about 3 years before the release of Nintendo's successor to the NES, it would see the release of the Sega Genesis, a console that oozes so much character that would make any brick wall jealous. It wouldn't have Sonic till later, but was still an awesome system, and one that I have a soft spot for thanks to all of those Genesis compilations Sega loves to make. As for the controller itself, well, look at it. This controller, while it looks cool, is still pretty much like the NES controller. Yeah, you have this quote extra unquote face button here, but just like the NES controller, there's still only 4 buttons in total. How are we going to perform zero to death in Street Fighter? The D-pad itself is a bit wonky to use as well. It feels like the Xbox 360's D-pad without the part where it's okay to use. There was definitely improvement to be had with this controller, which is why later on, Sega would release the 6-pack controller, now featuring 3 extra face buttons. It's certainly an improvement, and the D-pad is a bit better used now, but the design itself is so rather weird. Having 6 face buttons just makes games that would actually use them feel a bit off to play. For example, jump can be relegated to A, and the attack button can be relegated to Y, and can you imagine how tedious that would be to not accidentally hit one of the other buttons? I have rather big hands, so it would definitely be a problem with me and many others, and in my opinion, it loses some of the character that the original controller had. That controller had a sleek and cool look to it, that just said all the cool kids use me. But this controller looks more like a toy without the plastic and the sun looks. These controllers are still good to use, but they definitely had bizarre improvement syndrome, and that's something you wouldn't want to be caught having, alive or dead. 3 years later, we would see the release of the SNES, and where we would also be graced with the SNES controller's presence. What else is there to say about this thing? This controller is almost perfect, and its design would be replicated for many years to come. The D-pad is a great improvement from the NES controller's D-pad. The face buttons have an also satisfying mushy feel to them that I just love. The introduction of bumper buttons is such a great idea, and how games will use this layout to its advantage really goes to show just how awesome this controller is. And of course, they finally got rid of the sharp corners to something more suitable for long gaming sessions. I don't really have anything negative to say about it, it's just that good. Moving forward 3 more years, Nintendo would unintentionally create their biggest rival, Sony, in the form of the PlayStation, where we would get an SNES controller with extra steps. The general layout of the controller itself definitely oozes SNES controller, considering that initially, the PlayStation was going to be a CD add-on to the SNES, it's still wonder why it looks so similar. Of course, it's not one-to-one, and the controller does make some improvements from the SNES controller. For one, we have trigger buttons now, which is a great improvement, and actual handles for the controller, which definitely adds to the comfort factor. The D-pad is pretty good too, but I still prefer the SNES's D-pad over it. I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the D-pad being treated more like separate buttons in one mold, and D-pad itself is a bit too stiff for my liking, but it certainly does the job. The face buttons themselves are great to use though, just as good as the SNES controller face buttons. The buttons and triggers feel great to use too. Later on, Sony would release the DualShock controller, which is basically the original controller, but with the addition of dual analog sticks, which would be a feature retained in pretty much every traditional controller afterwards. All in all, it's definitely a solid controller, just like me. It would definitely be a time-tested controller design as pretty much every DualShock afterwards is pretty much the same vein, but with certain additions, and a slight redesign with the DualShock 4, and a name change with the DualSense. I would definitely have to give it to the DualShock 2 for the pressure-sensitive buttons though if I had to choose my favorite of the DualShocks. Sony was doing pretty well for themselves, so I was looking for Nintendo now. Well, Nintendo would release the Virtual Boy about a year after the PlayStation. The less I say about that, the better. Who the hell thought a dual D-pad design was a good idea? Especially with the way the ergonomics were designed. Moving past that, another year later, Nintendo would release their next home console in the form of the Nintendo 64. And I'm guessing someone at Nintendo R&D went, you know what game is missing? A controller that looks like a goddamn M, because that's exactly what we unfortunately got with the N64. This thing looks like an ancient, lost, futuristic piece of tech with how weirdly it's designed. We would see the actual introduction of the analog stick, which is cool and all, but did the analog stick have to be designed for ants with those that have really durable thumbs? The analog stick is just uncomfortable, no other way to describe it. The face buttons still feel good, as is the case for most Nintendo controllers, but there's not much to say about those. But what there is much to say about is who the actual hell thought it was a good idea to relegate camera control to a D-pad of all things. The C-pad is awful. It's not even like a traditional D-pad with how it's designed either, it's more like face buttons. How did people play games like GoldenEye on this thing? It's such a hard design choice, one that would look incredibly dumb when the DualShock came out the year after. At least the D-pad feels good, but just like the face buttons, Nintendo usually nails that, so it's not surprising. This controller in general is not favorable whatsoever, with its wacky ergonomic design that makes it so that you can't use the analog stick and the D-pad at the same time, looking like an M, the analog stick feeling horrible to use, and the awful C-pad. This controller really does feel like an attempt by Nintendo to innovate but not knowing how to. It's okay I guess for games like platformers and racers, but hard for any shooting game. Even though the controller for the N64 is bad, the console itself was still doing relatively well, though not as well as the SNES, but that's for other reasons besides the controller that I won't delve into for this video. On the opposite side of the spectrum, however, was Sega, who was not doing so well whatsoever due to conflict between Sega of America and Sega of Japan. Yeah, sure, it would be a great idea to release 2 different consoles around the same time as each other, not. Which is why later on, they would try to see what was left of their console division with the Dreamcast, a fun little console that died too soon, and to accompany it was a subpar controller. The actual design is fine and all, the face buttons and D-pad feel good, it's a good size, but why the hell is the analog stick a convex with no rubber on it? It's the N64 controller's analog stick all over again, though not as bad thankfully. Also, the fact that the controller cord is on the bottom is the fact that keeps me up at night. At least the triggers feel good to use though, and they're one of the first implementations of analog triggers in a controller ever, and actually give me original Xbox controller vibes whenever I use them. Speaking of which, after Sega would eventually stop making consoles and after the PS2 release, Microsoft joined the fray and declared, "We won't mess up like Sega," and gave us the original Xbox and Halo, which are two things I don't think any Doritos eating gamer can live without. And along with the system, we of course got the Why is this thing so big? It's bigger than some entire handheld systems even. And why do the ergonomics look so weird? The controller is making me sweat from anxiety, and I don't even have my sweat glands. Well, besides the sheer size of the controller, it definitely took some cues from the Sega controllers. For one, welcome back 6-space button design. I'm glad that later Xbox controllers got rid of these white and black buttons. They work much better as actual bumper buttons. The D-pad though? What the hell is this? It looks like an oversized bead, and doesn't feel good to use at all. Why are the analog sticks designed in the way that they are? Like one's a concave and the other is a very slight concave that functions more like a convex, and is not exactly comfortable. The analog triggers feel like the Dreamcast triggers, so they do feel pretty good. I actually do like the design. The controller just melts in my big hands. It feels pretty good to hold, but the design of the controller itself still doesn't feel that great, and it's perplexing. It's a strange controller for sure, but it's still okay. However, later on, the States would get the previously Japanese exclusive S controller, and this is a vast improvement. A respectable size, a better placement of the white and black buttons, better D-pad that would later become a mainstay in Xbox controllers, more comfortable analog sticks, and a slightly better feeling triggers. This is definitely the console's definitive controller, and it feels great to use. I'm shocked more people don't talk about it, even if for the most part the 360's controller is basically the same thing but better, but it's still a great controller that would later become the main layout for every Xbox controller afterwards. 3 days after the original Xbox release however, Nintendo gave us the GameCube, the lunchbox that just so happens to be able to play video games. Along with the admittedly rather meh launch lineup for the system, we got the GameCube's controller, and for as unconventional as it is today, there is a reason why this thing is still used today. Alongside being a great controller for Smash Bros, it's also pretty good to use, although I do have some gripes with it that I'm more than happy to talk about, such as the tiny D-pad. It would feel good to use if it wasn't made for ants. The C-stick also feels like it was made for ants, but it's still an improvement from gonorrhea. I do hate the fact that there's no second C button and no analog stick buttons like L3 and R3 on the DualShock controller though. While I prefer concave analog sticks, the GameCube's analog stick feels great to use. The rubber that it uses ensures that your thumb won't slip off while using it, and it definitely gets a point for that. The placement of the face buttons just work too, especially for the GameCube's library. Though for other libraries, you'll most likely have to edit what the face buttons do. The traditional B and A thing from what I said about the NES controller means that you'll have to awkwardly move your thumb from B to A while playing a GBA game on it. But other than that, it's still a great controller that just so happens to have an unconventional design that actually works. And speaking of unconventional, 5 years after the GameCube release, Nintendo released the Wii, and the whole thing about the Wii is that now you can control games with your arms. You want to play Wii Sports and punch Matt in the face? Well, you don't use the A button for that, silly. Instead, you actually throw a punch with the controller in hand, and that controller is the Wii Remote, though most simply just called the Wiimote. I see what you did there. Functionally, it looks like an NES controller with 3 extra face buttons in the form of the 1, 2, and home buttons. But in addition to that, you have actual arm movements to control the game with the remote, which made it perfect for when you want to swing the tennis racket and break the TV at the same time. The actual controller itself feels great to use, though the motion controls themselves were never really the best, even when they re-released them with improved motion controls under Wii Motion Plus. As for the buttons, they feel great, and the D-pad feels just as good to use, and I would say it's actually one of Nintendo's best D-pads. The controller is pretty good all things considered, and in addition to the normal controller, you can use the nunchuck for more normal control and motion control, as the nunchuck introduced 2 more bumper buttons and an analog stick. Feels good to use too, but the motion controls on there are even worse than the Wiimotes, so it can be a bit tedious to use at times for whenever it starts messing up in a game. If you are looking for a more traditional setup for the Wii though, look no further, as the classic controller has this covered. This is a traditional controller for the system that mostly serves the purpose of being able to play those virtual console games that you can get in the Wii Shop channel, though it's also supported by a lot of actual Wii games. The design of it is great. It's basically an SNES controller mixed with a Wiimote, though without the motion control part, as the classic controller lacks motion control. The additions to it include 2 analog sticks, the home button, and 2 extra bumper buttons, which look like jelly beans. It feels good to use, though I would like it more if it had actual handles, which were thankfully added in with the Classic Controller Pro, which is basically the same controller, but of course, with handles. Now we fast forward to the modern day, where game controllers haven't really changed that much from the 2000s, such as the traditional controllers looking like the DualShock, or the normal Xbox controller like the Switch Pro controller, and we still have motion controllers in the form of the controllers accompanied with VR headsets. It's been quite the journey for these guys, and I can only imagine what else the future has in store for us when it comes to video game controllers. Though, to be fair, considering I'm just the brain, all I can really do is imagine, so I guess that sentence is a bit redundant. But anyways, thank you for taking the time to listen to me ramble on about video game controllers. I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Now, if you excuse me, I need a hair trim.